Hi everybody, I am candidate master Khanya Mazibuko from ThinkChess, and today we'll be looking at a very interesting topic, which is the importance of development and what to do when your opponent does not do it. It is essential that you take your pieces out in the opening quickly and fastly in order to get your pieces playing in the game. And we'll be looking at a bunch of examples where if your opponent actually neglects this and gives you the advantage, you will actually exploit it with the almost lethal attack. Let's get started. So first we're going to be looking at Gilbert Lazard from Paris 1924. The game starts off d4. White is claiming control in the center and at the same time opens up his bishop on c1 and the queen on d1. Black calmly goes knight to f6, controlling the e4 square and also preventing white to get the full center with pawn to e4. But white now does a very weird idea and is very insistent on getting control on the square e4 and plays a weird developing move, knight to d2. Now, whenever we're developing our pieces, there is a guiding principle which helps us understand where to put our pieces. If we develop our pieces, we always want to develop them towards the center, which is the 4 key squares, which is always known as chess land. For whereby is the capital of all the chess pieces. It's practically the party which everybody wants to go to. And unfortunately, white does not allow the white knights to get closer to chess land. So now, black takes advantage of this idea and quickly opens up the position with the move e5. A wowsover move, sacrificing the pawn and also opening up the bishop on f8, starting an attack because of the coordination, or the bad coordination of white's pieces. Pawn takes e5. And now we'll see the idea of black's idea. Knight to g4, attacking the pawn on e5 and having a sneaky idea that if the move which was played, pawn to h3, which was actually the last move actually played by white. Because if you actually look into the white's position, you'd understand now that there's actually a lot of weaknesses actually going on there. But we're going to highlight a very interesting concept. In the opening or in every given position, which starts off in every single game, the square f7 and f2 are extremely weak because they are always protected by the king. If you think about all the other pawns, all the pawns on e4, e2, d2, c2, b2, a2, g2 and h2 have protection from other pieces except for the pawns on f2 and f7. And now a wowsover move comes in now. If you can pause the video and quickly find it for yourself, it makes for great exercise. I hope you found the interesting move knight to e3, highlighting the fact that all of these pieces are still not developed. And if the interesting f takes e3 occurs, then queen to h4, because the diagonal on e1 until h4 is now open, allows for this beautiful smothered mate. Now pawn to g3 and then queen to g3, checkmate. Very nice game and very short. Let's look at another example. In this game, Delagal Brie, which is also played in Paris, is a very famous example, which I love looking at all the time. So it goes out by starting with e4 and e5. Really good moves by both sides as they are both developing or allowing development to actually occur. And both these pawns are controlling key squares in the center. Knight to f3 and pawn to d6, the Philidor defense. Now, this move actually is blocking the bishop on f8, but actually is overprotecting the pawn on e5. But it kind of hinders black's development, but very solid setup. Bishop to c4, attacking again the key square that we've been highlighting, f7. Now, black develops the bishop to g4, making a bit of an inaccuracy. In the opening, whenever you have an option to develop a bishop or a knight, because the knight is always the slower unit, it is recommended and almost law to develop it before you develop your bishops. So knight to c3, developing his last piece into the game, and now black does a really big mistake. g6, neglecting his development. Now in this position, it is almost completely better for white, as not only has he developed one piece and made many weaknesses in his camp, because the square f7 is still not protected. As you've noticed, all he has accomplished is get a bishop out on g4. Now, knight takes e5, opening up an attack on the f7 square. But you've noticed a queen is hanging on d1. And if you think about it, if black takes the queen, he will be winning a huge amount of material. But then you'd realize something now. White has 3 pieces out in the attack, whilst black has no pieces except for a bishop, which is trapped on d1, which is almost easy for him to find a very deadly attack. Bishop takes f7, king e7, and now a really nice, interesting finishing move, knight to d5, checkmate. All of these examples have a really nice common theme, which helps us understand that if our opponent does not allow his development to help him cover the square f7, it can actually be the most easiest target to be the attack forefront and allow them to actually break through into the chains or in the gates of the black camp in this game. Let's look at another example. Now we have Dominant and another not so well known play, which is a game played in London also in the year 1932. So this is one of my favorite games, which involves a very tricky move to find. So the game starts off with e4, obviously claiming a huge control in the center with d5 and opening up his pieces. Pawn to c6, also trying to get a control over the important d5 square, which white kind of took under his control. So pawn to d4, opening up both these bishops and almost allowing for easy and smooth development. Pawn to d5. This is actually in the opening, which is actually one of the former world champions' favorites, Vishwanath Anand, which is called the Karo card. Now, bishop to d3, breaking a principle which is not such a common move. Mostly in these positions, as a guiding principle is knight to d2 or knight to c3, always trying to get the control on e4 more easier, because right now this move, pawn to d5, not only puts pressure on the pawn on e4, but at the same time is a good move claiming the center. So bishop to d3 kind of doesn't protect the pawn on d4, but is a very much playable move. Knight to f6, trying to put more pressure on the e4 square, and now finally white pushes on because it's getting much harder to defend that pawn. Pawn to e5, and now knight f to d7. If you look at this position once again, you realize something. Black actually has not developed any pieces, and in a move like knight to d7 does actually restrict the development of the bishop even on c8. So now it's almost very interesting to understand that white actually now has an advantage. So the person with the advantage obviously has the duty and the right to attack. So obviously, trying to open up the game, white pushes on. e6, attacking once again the big weakness in black's camp. And as you notice more and more, the square on f7 is an easy target for black to actually attack, which is why all our development should be harmonious in such a way that allows us to kind of protect that square. Now, f takes e6, he's trying to actually take a pawn and maybe get his knight back into the game and hopefully get his king out of danger. But unfortunately, white does not give him this chance. He goes queen to h5, check. And after pawn to g6, I want you to actually think about this move for yourself. In this very position, white has a stunner of a move. I hope you found it. The most interesting move, queen takes g6. Not only sacrificing the queen for a pawn, but this leads to a huge mate. All because a knight on d7 is actually hindering the development of the black pieces. A nice example. And finally, we've got a really great game. This is a beautiful game and one of my favorites, which actually starts off with pawn to e4, pawn to e5. Again, both sides calmly trying to open up the game, controlling the center and trying to get their pieces. Knight to f3 and knight to c6. The move knight to f3 obviously is attacking the pawn on e5, so the move knight to c6 is a developing move and also a move which is kind of protecting the pawn on e5. Now white continues, bishop to c4, once again trying to target that key square, f7. Black calmly defends it, knight to f6, and now he goes pawn to d4, putting another pawn in the center and obviously allowing the development of the bishop on c1. Now black takes the pawn takes d4, neglecting development but also grabbing a pawn. Not a bad idea, it's actually a playable idea, and it proves out to be a bit too risky in this game though. A move like castles. Finally, white has actually completed two opening principles, which is getting his pieces out and finally castling, whilst black is still 2 moves away from completing his development and castling. He goes on to go pawn to d6, trying to open up the development of the bishop on c8. White continues, knight takes d4, winning back his pawn, and bishop to e7. Now, you might be asking yourself, why wasn't the move knight takes e4, trying to win another pawn in the opening possible? But then you understand the principle once again. Development is more important in the opening than pawn hunting, because a move like rook e1 and the rook is pinned to the defense of the king on e8, and a move, maybe let's say pawn to d5, runs into an interesting knight takes d4, and this position is already really hard for black to actually come. Bishop takes d5, and this position is already really hard for black to come back. A move like queen takes d5 runs into overpinning the piece on e4 and attacking the queen on d5, knight to c3, and it's very hard to actually suggest a move, because a move like queen takes d4 runs into rook takes e4 check, which is both an attack on the king and the queen on d4, allowing whites to win some nice material. Going back to the position, so you place bishop to e7, trying hard to save the position. Now knight to c3, developing his pieces, and finally castles. But now we'll be thinking to ourselves, isn't black out of the woods? Yes, he should be. Pawn to h3 by white, trying to open up a window so that there are some not tricks on the back rank. But rook e8, a really good developing move, putting a rook into the center. Rook e1, and now this is in this position now, because black is almost done his development. He has to just get the bishop, make a plan to get the bishop on c8 out into the game, and he has completed his development. But instead of playing a move maybe like bishop to d7 or maybe pawn to b6 after, say, a subsequent knight takes d4, like in this position, he does an interesting idea. He says knight to d7, maybe with an idea of putting the knight to the square on c5, which is a bit more aggressive, putting more pressure on the pawn to e4, and allow the bishop to go to that square where it was on f6, and get it on a much better diagonal. This is a really good idea by black, but unfortunately, it is neglecting the development. So, right now, in this position, I want you to think about a really interesting idea. Why to play and win. I hope you thought of it again. And yes, again, you are right. The square on f7 is weak once again. So it's no wonder that a move like bishop takes f7 is almost completely winning. Now, after king takes f7, I hope you found the whole continuation, as in this position right here, the last move, knight to e6, highlights the fact that not is only the queen smothered, but that king is in a very, very dangerous position, because a move like king takes e6, being very greedy, taking another piece, runs to a checkmate after the move like queen to d5, king to f6, and queen to f5. And that's all they wrote. That is a very, very interesting topic that we've just covered. Development is very important for always our king to be safe and always the protection of the f7 square. I hope you've learned as much as I did today, and I hope to see you in the next lesson. This is Khanya Mazibuko.